Good day, everyone. Notice I didn't say good morning. I finally, toward the end of the term, have come to the realization that it's not morning for you necessarily, although good day does sound like a sort of antiquated phrase. I'm not sure why. Anyhow, communication. So, communication is another important part of this sort of puzzle, right? So the title of course, is The Climate Crisis, What It Is, and What Each of Us Can Do About It. Communication comes under that last thing. So we've looked at things you can do: personal action, activism, political action, and they're all sort of interrelated. But communication is another important thing that you can do. And it's a good way to leverage the effect that you have in the world by communicating to people. And unfortunately, it's necessary, and in a way, we're all called upon to do it. And the fossil fuel interests and a range of other different interests out there, are spending an enormous amount of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, communicating to the public. Unfortunately, communicating disinformation, but being very good at it and effective at it. So it would be great if we had, interests that had that sort of money and that sort of influence, but it's just not there. And, scientists have, we saw in the movie Merchants of Doubt with James Hansen, scientists have been called upon to do this, and people like Hansen, very important scientist with respect to, atmospheric climate change, is not a spokesperson. He's not familiar with how to communicate effectively and all. I mean, he certainly tries, and he certainly should be commended. But we need other communicators to do this, and people are trying to step up to do it. We saw at the very beginning, Leonardo DiCaprio, another unlikely candidate, but doing what he can. And I think we all have to try to do that, or we certainly should consider doing it. And it is a way of leveraging our impact in the world. The difficulty with communication is it's one, hard, and it's two, very varied. It is, interestingly, or I find interesting, the thing that I have to struggle a good bit with, and in fact did with creating this course. And I have sort of ideal circumstances here that you wouldn't as a communicator. What I mean by that is, well, I have you sort of as a captive audience for 10 weeks, and I can demand of you a good bit that, you devote 5 or 6 hours per week on this, and I can, check to make sure you're doing it with the quizzes and all, which I know annoy a lot of people. Sorry. But still, I can cover a lot of ground. I can do things that you probably couldn't do, which is suggest that people watch something that's difficult or unpleasant, things that people wouldn't normally want to do. So, for example, the first third of the course, where we dealt with the problem itself, when you read things like David Wallace Wells, I think a lot of people, if you just suggest that they read something like that, probably wouldn't get all the way through it and would stop. But I can, be assured that if you stay in the class, that you will do all that and then get through and deal with other things that we have. It's an ideal scenario, which is why I think, and I'm convinced, that education, formal education, whether it's in a university setting like this or, K through 12, is where we need to be doing this, because we do have students sitting, wanting to learn, and I think it's an obligation that among, all the other things that we teach them about this. Anyhow, you also can take on the role of communicator. And the article that we read by Richard Somerville is a very good one, obviously, is why I gave it to you. But Somerville is principally focusing on one sort of extreme, and that would be people that you would encounter, Uncle Pete, in your lives, who, are climate change deniers. And in a way, it's a great thing to focus on for Somerville, because that would be the toughest audience to communicate to, I think. And, keeping your cool, being able to do it effectively. It's important, and I think it's important, and we'll talk about this, how to go about that and why it's, just so centrally important. But if you think about it, communication can take all different sorts of forms, and what he mentions in the article, audience, really needs to be taken into account. What I mean by that is, you may, well, hardcore people like Uncle Pete are a minority in the United States, a relatively small minority, in fact. And these are people who are absolutely positively, going to dig in their heels that the climate crisis either isn't happening or not caused by human beings or whatever. A far larger group is not what we would call climate change deniers, but skeptics. And skeptics are just not quite sure that it's as bad as we say it is, not quite sure that we can afford to do the kind of changes that are necessary. And that group has to be, I think, spoken to and communicated with in a different way than deniers, because they're already partly, on, taking your position, but you have to sort of move them more into it. And what in communicating in that case might be something like, well, did you know? Yes. Well, what was, for example, what we read with Project Drawdown, that yes, wind turbines are expensive. They may cost $1 billion to put in. I mean, $1 trillion to put in. It's almost unthinkably, large amount of money, but they will save many trillions of dollars in the upcoming decades because, they're so much more efficient than fossil fuels. So, being able to communicate something like that to a person who has those concerns makes sense. The problem is with all this that you have to know a lot to be able to communicate to different people in different ways. You have to know facts like that to be able to roll it out. And hopefully this class has given you a lot of that, information already, which was one of the goals of it, so that, encountering different people, you can talk to them in different ways. And that is the challenge. There may be other people that totally agree with what you say. Maybe your friends and all totally agree with it. But then there may be other issues that you need to address, because many people, are in a state of almost being petrified by fear, or that, they know about the climate crisis, but they just don't want to think about it, right? It's just something that is just so overwhelming that they just, live their lives and don't stop to think about it. How do you, do an intervention with someone like that and get them to actually address it? There may be other people who totally agree with you, who totally want to do things, but just aren't quite sure what to do, where to start, and they want to, and maybe, they think they should be out in the streets protesting and all, which you should. I mean, the climate march here last fall, and, Santa Barbara streets were filled with people, UCSB students included, protesting. And that's great, but then there are little things that you can do all day long, and in that case, climate communication could be something like giving someone a recipe for a really good largely plant-based meal, the things that someone can do like that, and that makes clear that the kind of communication that you can do is really varied, right? I mean, you could literally, and I when I asked people if they had any ideas for YouTube videos that we could, that other people in the class would like, one of the folks I shared principally gives recipes in her blog and in her YouTube channel, and I thought, well, that's really can be very effective, because there are a lot of people, they want to do something, but they don't know what to do. And communication then can take, in some cases, an almost non-verbal form, even though we don't think of it that way. So for a number of years, a number of people here at UCSB, led by David Cleveland, who's a professor in environmental studies, who just retired, who also grew up on a farm. But David was trying to get a food truck here at Santa Barbara at UCSB. And the idea is that the truck would just pop up across campus here and there and give you free food. But of course, it would be simple to make, inexpensive, largely plant-based food. So, you'd be able to get a little bowl of chili and you say, wow, this chili is really good. And, well, it's not beef chili at all, but it's lentil chili, or here's a black bean burrito or something. And the notion is that, a lot of people just think that, a vegan diet or largely plant-based diet is eating salads all the time. And nothing could be further from the truth, but you'd have to communicate to those folks that, there are other, lots of other things that you could eat. I mentioned my own, in the little lecture I gave, I mentioned my own thing with vegan and vegetarian and all that. But it's also the case that, because I only, I don't have that many great techniques of my own to do, so I kind of use that one a lot, which I do with my electric bike. So we're not on campus now, but if you're on campus, you may notice that I usually am walking with a bike next to me, and I actually bring it into classes with me and into meetings with me. And I do that. It's a very practical thing because I can get around campus really quickly on that. But the other reason is, and it's my very subtle way of communication, is I don't say anything at all. I just come in with the bike, and people invariably ask what it is because it looks different than a normal bike. It's a pedelec. You pedal, and it has electric power too. And of course, when they ask about that sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is this odd-looking bike, there it begins, right? I then say, "Oh, that's my pedelec," and people, what's a pedelec? And I usually say, "Oh, it was a great ride coming in. I live downtown in Santa Barbara." That's where it stops, but it doesn't, because people then say, "Wait, you rode that in from Santa Barbara? How far is that?" It's 10-mile ride, 20-mile round trip. You do a 20-mile round trip on a bike? Yeah, well, it's this is electric assisted. I do pedal, but you don't have to. Actually, I can just push a button and I can go the whole way in, just on pure electric power. And I go into things, they ask more about, California has some of the most liberal bicycle laws in the United States. In the world, really. My bike can do 28 miles an hour, which is very fast, doesn't require a license, doesn't require insurance. It's incredibly cheap compared to a car. But all that people ask me for, and all that I do just by, kind of by example. But again, I'm not pushing anything on anyone. I am just giving people the opportunity to learn about alternative, transportation and personal mobility options, and how you can, put that bike on the front of the bus if I don't feel like riding home, and so on and so on. So if you think about it, there are lots of opportunities to do that, to communicate. And it's something I think that we need to think more about if you are interested in this, because it can take other forms. It can take you can communicate to people about the political options that we have when it comes to voting. One of the, as I mentioned in one of the earlier lectures, one of the frustrating things is that as people get younger, as voters get younger, they tend to, and it's not a hard, fast rule, but they tend to vote less, so that the youngest group voting, that would be you folks, compared to the oldest group, that would be Donald Trump's generation, they literally are voting twice as much as you are. So twice as many people are getting out to vote. So anything you can do to convince people to get out to vote, and even, I always in class when we get near election time or near when it's time to register, tell people to vote. I'm not telling people what to vote at all, but just get out and vote. I mean, that's what everyone says we care so much about democracy in America and all, but if you care, you'll vote. But people don't always know who to vote for. So again, if you can make clear that you're, that voting is a cool thing to do, and if people ask, and you can just sort of throw out there, it's hard to figure out who to vote for, and a good environmental choice. people might ask then, well, wait, who is a good environmental choice and all? So, but if you think about it, since voting is so important and all, if by way of communication you can get one, two, or three people in, your immediate sphere of influence to vote, that's huge. I mean, it's absolutely huge. I mean, if everyone in our class did that, it's, thousands of people. I mean, that's huge. So I get to the comments, but I just wanted to underscore from the very beginning the importance of communication, all different sorts of communication with all different sorts of people and communicating in all different sorts of ways. And again, if the climate change denialists weren't so effective, then I guess it wouldn't fall on our shoulders as much. But we really need people communicating this. So if it is the case that you want to do something in addition to personal action, activism, and political action, this is another. And it's all related, because you could be communicating about personal action. The act of communication, I think, can be thought of as a form of activism itself, and of course it can be about political issues. So, but anyhow, let's jump into our deep dive material, which was terrific this week. And let's go up to the first one here. Yeah, let you read that while I take a sip of my tea here. We do already have the technology. A lot of people think that's the problem. It's not the problem. It's this person writing me a note. The problem lies elsewhere. One of the problems, and it really is more than one problem, being an uninformed public, mostly through no fault of their own. Okay, that was the person had a longer comment, but I thought that was a wonderful observation and to start on. The problem is a largely uninformed public, and mostly through no fault of their own. And it's worth pausing on that, because if you encounter an Uncle Pete or someone anywhere, in the spectrum from denier to skeptic and all, you can, it's very easy to become, and I know this from personal experience, to become very angry with folks like that, and to have the whole discussion, if it even is a discussion, adversarial, that they're on one side, you're on the other side. But what this person noted here is right. It's even with, a hardcore Uncle Pete, it's mostly through no fault of their own, because, if you want to lay, blame here somewhere, it's, with the fossil fuel industry, its affiliates and all sorts of other, organizations that are spreading disinformation and leveraging people's fears and all. And if you think about it, then the people who are convinced by all that disinformation, they're really, in a way, they're not the cause of the problem, and in a way, not to put too strong an edge on it, but they're victims here too. These are people who have been, tricked and, coerced in a certain way by larger interests that, don't want us to act on the climate crisis. So if you think of it that way, think of it adversarially is wrong, because this person that you're, encountering and are across from, it's not an evil person. I mean, this isn't a person who came up with this, all these theories that, he or she may be espousing. Well, they didn't think of them by themselves. These were all put there in their head by someone else. And as a consequence, your role, if you take on the job of trying to communicate to Uncle Pete, is to counter that information with other information. And in that sense, what's really happening is you're actually sort of a combatant with the ideas that were put there by these other groups. And what's at stake is the person there in front of you. They're not the adversary. They're the person who, who needs to be informed and hopefully needs to be swayed over. So it's a communication thing happening, but it's the person there is sort of in the middle rather than on the opposite side from you. So I thought that was a very good observation, really apt. Let's go up here. Talking to an Uncle Pete, I think would be challenging because it's hard to control the anger I feel in their ignorance or something that is over something that's obviously happening. Another great point, but again, I think if you don't get angry with the person, I mean, you might get angry with the fact that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent to confuse people like Uncle Pete. That's fair enough, but to actually get angry at them, I don't think that's very useful. And I think it is obviously the go-to emotion, and it's the one that might be hard to forget in the middle of a conversation with someone who's so adamant, and vitriolic that they're in fact kind of a victim here. But I do think that anger in that case is it's not in that case, and not in a lot of cases, helpful. But it was a great observation, I thought, to put both of these in the beginning, because if when talking to Uncle Pete, and we'll talk about other types of communication, just a really good thing to keep in mind. Yeah, many people picked up on this, the idea of comparing climate scientists to physicians or doctors. I'd never thought of making this comparison before reading this, and it really stuck with me. It's true that people do not question doctors in the same way that they question climate change, and this can be due to political influence or sheer ignorance. First off, yes, I think Somerville's comparison there is great. And by the way, we saw this already, right, in Merchants of Doubt, and then I think Climate of Doubt. I think it was in both films, where Bob Inglis, who was this hardcore Republican congressperson, who came out and said that he believed in climate change, and immediately he didn't even win his party's primary, was immediately voted out of office. But the last thing he said when he had the floor of Congress and sort of worldwide attention was that if you had a sick child, and he's a parent, so he really wanted to drive this home, and you went to 98 doctors, and they all said, this is the problem, this is how you should treat this, and there were two oddball doctors who disagreed. Who in the world would listen to those two oddball doctors? You would agree, you'd take the consensus of 98. And I thought it was effective because he did shift over to talking about like medicine. And I think that very analogy that he used, I think, is an effective one if you encounter an Uncle Pete, if you're in that position. Unfortunately, as COVID has shown us, people do challenge medical doctors as well. Anthony Fauci, of course, I've listened to him on a number of podcasts now, and the most recent one, I think it was Science Friday, where he's been on multiple times because of this. He's noticed that he gets serious death threats and threats against him and his family like every day now. And all because he's trying to do his job as a responsible physician and scientist, and to tell the country what the reality is. And a lot of people, are, seriously angry with him. And that's, it's an important issue. It's an issue for probably another class, and I have another class where we deal with this issue more generally of how people are largely in opposition to science in many ways. So, what's the common denominator here with, whether it's climate science or with medicine? It's science. And that is an issue that it's a very important one with something like vaccinations and all, the anti-vax movement. Long before, COVID, and this was an issue which I've dealt with in classes, how do people come to this conclusion to counter science and counter medicine and all, and yet they do. So, although I agree with Somerville, this is a good analogy, and I would encourage, if you ever are across from an Uncle Pete, to roll that thing out about 98 doctors. But it's unfortunately not necessarily a silver bullet here, because it for many people, the general skepticism here is with science, which is really unfortunate. So, but anyhow, let's jump to the next one. Yeah. So my little talk about communicating without words and let people come to you. A couple of years ago, had a friend. She was a vegan, but she did not advertise it in the way that I've seen other advertise their veganism on social media, which people do. Some people get crazy about it, right? I became intrigued about her experience in eating a vegan diet and what led her to those choices. After a few long informative discussions and a couple of vegan turkey sandwiches, I made the decision to cut meat out of my diet. I have now been vegetarian for over 2 years without any pressuring or persuading. When I moved in with a different friend last year, she eventually noticed I didn't eat meat and then asked about it. I explained my reasons. One day she came to me and said, I'm giving up beef for Lent, and she hasn't eaten beef since. A few months later, she informed me that her brother stopped eating beef as well. In retrospect, I'm amazed by the power of this form of passive communication and the domino effect it has created. I think people are intrigued by, personal decisions that we make, whether it's what we eat or riding an electric bike or doing all sorts of things. And I think it can have an influence on people, and definitely have, an important influence on people. But it's not all rosy, and this is what's so great about this comment, because it's not over. I'm going to continue it here. So this form of passive communication, has a domino effect. My little domino train came to a screeching halt when I moved back home at the start of COVID. My family has constantly made fun of all my choices and opinions regarding climate change ever since I became vegetarian. I've tried countless methods of communication with all my family members, but they refuse to even consider anything I have to say. I've shown them the data and cited my sources and debunked the myths and presented the solutions. I've explained the science and the politics and the industries behind everything. They just aren't interested in hearing what I have to say. Both Ken's video and this week's reading, Communicating the Climate Crisis, provide a lot of useful tools for communicating climate change, but I'm not sure if there is any way to effectively communicate with someone that refuses to listen. I used to be passive about my feelings regarding climate change because my family would immediately knock them down. The struggle of communicating the climate crisis is real. Yeah, what a great comment, right? So the first half that I started with about this person, seeing the power of passive communication, that it was like dominoes and a domino effect and all, and yet sort of, to vary the metaphor, hitting a brick wall with this person's family. Yeah, I think the reality is that's the reality, that communication is not always going to work, or not going to work well. And you're going to encounter people. And I think, Somerville gives you the most difficult type of person in this character of Uncle Pete. And they're going to be very hard to communicate with. And as, we started off, people noted, it's going to be, hard to just not get angry when you encounter someone like this, because, hey, the planet and our future and your future, all of our futures are at stake. And yet you're not going to get through to people like that. I think that is a reality. And I think you have to realize that with communication. And I accept that, by the way, with this class, because I didn't do it in our class. I could have done it by way of Gaucho Space, but I didn't really want to. But when I've taught this class in English 22 in person, I use for role plus to get to poll people on what they feel at the iClicker, so people can anonymously respond to questions that I ask. And I asked this question in a variety of different ways throughout each term. And that is to try to get a feel for who in the room is an actual climate skeptic. What I mean by that is not a denier, because I don't know that we have that many hardcore deniers among the student population at UCSB, but people who, when I ask them, do you think that the climate crisis has been overhyped? That's actually a phrase that deniers use, and as far as I can figure, that they've coined. And you can immediately tell, by the way, at least I can, because I encounter a lot of denial literature. When you encounter an Uncle Pete and they start rolling out phrases that they've heard, like, they'll say something like, well, I'm not saying it's not happening, but I think it's been overhyped. The very fact they use that phrase is an indication that they've been, I don't know how to say it, but they've been influenced. I was going to say poisoned by denial literature, but they have definitely been influenced, and you can see the signs of it in various, either theories or even phrases like that they roll out. But anyhow, when I asked students in the class, there are a not insignificant amount that would fit under that category of having been influenced by denial literature and being not sure that the climate crisis is happening or as severe as it is. Statistically, I found on average it comes in about 16%. So that's not a totally small number. That suggests that, and maybe even in our class, 1 in 6 people think that I'm overreacting or too severe, or that the climate crisis is, happening, but maybe not as bad as I'm saying it is, or just stuff we're reading. And there are some people that have come right out and, called this course, propaganda, that it is just, trying to convince you of something that's not true. And so they're acknowledging that the communicative role of it. I'm communicating something, but they think what it is I'm communicating is propaganda. But look, the fact is, there are some people, and this comment is so great, that you're not going to get through to, at least at that moment in time. And I realize, and I feel this person's exasperation, because, just when it seems like, this person was having a good experience at UCSB, communicating and being communicated to by roommates and all, that you then go back home and you encounter people that just are intractable. I just wouldn't let that be discouraging. I would expect that. I'm not sure you'll remember this comment if you're in the future, if you're having a similar experience, but I would fully expect it, and it's just it's not going to happen. And I would also say, in a bigger picture, in terms of, say, the United States and climate policy, it is not the case that we are going to get 100% of people totally on board for all the changes that are needed for the Green New Deal, or even like a global Marshall Plan for the Earth. It's just not the case that that's going to happen. I mean, it would be great, and I hope it does, but being realistic, I just don't think that. But what that means, however, is that, the majority of people have to be convinced that it's real, and they have to vote accordingly, and then politicians will act accordingly. There will be a group, I'm not sure, that's probably going to be more than 16%, probably more than 1 in 6 Americans who are unhappy with it, don't agree with it, are going to be railing against it and all. But that's just the way it is. So in terms of like communicating with this person, for example, made the wonderful comment here, expect it and then move on and do what you can. And look, and again, as the people noted at the beginning, or as I noted on the comment, don't get angry, realize they've been sort of victimized here, and maybe a time will come when they will come to you, and let that happen. But if not, just accept it and move on, because it is a reality. It is absolutely a reality that, and I want to quote this person again and see if I can get back to that. It is a reality that your little domino train is going to come to a screeching halt. That's such a good image. Okay. When it comes to effective communication, how you say it and who says it is more important than what you say. Chapter 8 in the preparation section notes trusted messengers. So pause on that phrase. We're going to talk about it. Idea of being a messenger can have enormous impact and can motivate people to bring about change. Messengers can carry certain personas that draw groups of people in. So the book mentions Catherine Hayhoe. By the way, you've seen her both in both of the Doubt movies. She was the climate scientist, and she's married to a Christian minister. So she notes how her faith is very important to her. war, but she doesn't have any problem with her Christian faith and the climate crisis being at odds and all. So this person making the comment notes that he or she had the opportunity to attend 2 of her lectures at UCSB in January, a little over a year ago. The first was a conversation session in a small lecture hall. This more intimate meeting was geared toward topics of engagement and outreach. Dr. Hayhoe described what she calls the outreach spectrum, the many different ways and degrees of which people are involved in environmental activism. It ranges from being a scientist and writing scholarly articles to being a nature photographer and running an Instagram account. So just to underscore that, you can be an activist and communicate. Yes, the way we might all, the go-to thing we might think about being a climate scientist and, trying to tell the world what's going on. But yes, and writing scholarly articles too, but you could be a nature photographer. And why does that matter? Well, if people value nature and you help them do that through your photographs, people are going to have less of an appetite for its destruction and want to, save it and get involved with the conservation of those places. And running an Instagram account too, and running an Instagram account, as a nature photographer would be a great way to get that out there. And her point being made here, there are so many ways that you can get involved in environmental outreach that everyone has a place in the movement. You just have to find your niche. Such a great point. Again, you're probably not going to be a scientist. I suspect there will be people in this class that will be scientists, but it doesn't have to be the way that you can communicate. She made sure to note that not everyone can or should play certain roles. For example, if you're poor at public speaking, don't engage in outreach that involves public speaking. If you aren't religious, don't be the person that tries to work in churches. Good advice. Someone else can and will fill these roles, and you can pick up one that's most suitable for you and exciting for you. And again, great comment here. Suitable and exciting, right? There are things that you really care about. So going back to my first thing, if you really like cooking and you get excited about that and enjoy it, what a great thing for you to share and express how to, because again, a lot of people just aren't even aware of what kind of things they could be eating as an option to a burger, and how to cook it. And people often assume, well, yeah, but that's going to be really expensive. You're going to have to go to Whole Foods and buy a lot of really expensive products, and you just can't afford that. Well, you can go to Trader Joe's and get a 3-pound bag of rice for $3, or a bag of lentils for pretty much the same amount per pound. And you can make an enormous amount of things with those, and a range of vegetables and all. So yeah, but anyhow, find the thing that works best for you. Being a climate change messenger, and again, such a good idea, such a good phrase there, thinking of yourself, even if kind of an amateur climate change messenger, but that's what you can be. It's not for everyone, but for the people who have the speaking skills, outgoing personality, or any sort of platform, and especially online platforms, a good role for you. Hearing Dr. Hayhoe describe the outreach spectrum in this way really inspired me to start thinking about what I'm good at and how I can start using my talents and passions to be a better advocate and activist for the planet. Just repeat that, start thinking about what you're good at and how you can start using your particular talents, your particular passion to be an advocate and activist for the planet. Yeah, what a great comment, and really important, especially now, because we're in an era where, one, you can do this in little day-to-day ways, right? So the previous comment, the person whose domino train came to a grinding halt. First, very effective, just with roommates and all, letting people who you encounter in your life who may be curious about your life and all. But especially now with, as this most recent comment noted, platforms, online platforms can be incredibly powerful, even if it's just an Instagram account of your nature photography. Last year when I taught this course, a student came up to me who actually was in the honors section too, and noted that his sister had started a YouTube account a few years before, and it started off very slowly, and she was doing a lot of lifestyle things, but focusing on the environment. And started off slowly, and she did it just because she felt passionate about it. She just wanted, she found out things and all, she wanted to communicate them and get them out there. And it grew over the years and then started growing very quickly. And when he drew my attention to it last year, she had 500,000 subscribers. And I just checked this weekend before doing this, and she's now up to over 650,000 subscribers. We live in an interesting era with respect to communication, right? It didn't used to be this way, that if you were trying to communicate to people, you would be limited to, your sphere of influence, unless you happen to be a professional communicator, like a journalist or a filmmaker or something. Those people had a lot more control over what we think than they do now, insofar as, and this is a good thing about the internet. People will often complain about it, and the Social Dilemma, that film on Netflix, is right to draw attention to pretty much everything that draws attention to. But there's something wonderful about, social media and the internet in general, in that it is, it promises to be very democratic, that anyone can produce their own content, that anyone can be a filmmaker. I'm kind of a filmmaker right now. Anybody who has a camera and can, figure out how to turn it on and look in it and upload it to YouTube can do something, can communicate. And that's pretty remarkable. And I think there's an enormous amount of potential power there, more than, if you are interested in communicator or being the wonderful phrase that this person uses here, climate change messenger, that's a way to do it. I'm not saying you have to do that, but I think it is worth pausing on that particular idea, because you can impact so many people, right? And you don't necessarily even have to have your own YouTube channel. You could just post something somewhere, and things go viral and influence thousands of people. So one of the classes I taught in the fall, that I just taught, which is on, climate change media, and everyone in the class, I mentioned this before, produce their own either YouTube video or TikTok videos, or script a podcast, an audio podcast. It's just something to think about, that if you happen to be really passionate about this, you have all these new avenues available, and that, it's funny, because if you think about something like a YouTube channel, and let's say you just have, I don't know, 50 subscribers or 100 subscribers. Well, people would chuckle at that and say, well, there are people that have 100 million subscribers. True. But you have 50 people listening to you? I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? I mean, if, traditionally our sphere of influence would have just been the people that we encountered, but, 50 people, 100 people actually interested in what you're saying. I mean, again, you might think that's inconsequential, but that's pretty staggering to me. I mean, if everyone had that. No. Anyhow, I thought that was a very good point about, if you want to do something, there are these other things like personal action and all important. And this is a kind of personal action, but the idea of being a climate change messenger, even if it's in subtle ways, with a roommate or something, or in other ways that are now available to us. And again, I think so much this is necessary, because the, denial is so rampant in the country, and the people spreading denial kind of need a counter force in the world, I think. Anyhow, I know that most people's reaction to this reading will likely be appreciation for how the author attempts to communicate climate change. However, while reading the chapter, I was immediately struck by how disheartening the whole thing was. The fact alone the scientists need to put so much thought into their communication of climate science is beyond me. And this goes back to James Hansen, which we saw in Merchants of Doubt, where he just assumed that he would tell the world, what he had discovered, and that the world would then notice. And that was back in 1988, when he nationally brought our collective attention to it by, appearing before Congress and telling the facts, and nothing happened. As the chapter mentions, medical science would never be scrutinized to the same extent. I'd be hard-pressed to believe any field would. Rather, trusting the professionals the fossil fuel industry has been so successful rather than trusting the professionals, the fossil fuel industry has been so successful at causing doubt that climate scientists now have to take time away from their work. And that would be, of course, Richard Somerville, who was a climate scientist who took time away from his work to write this. And what he was trying to do is to equip readers with communication tactics to reinforce something that is, in fact. While I appreciate that the author is trying to make climate science more accessible and understandable, it's shameful that this is even something that needs to be considered. Why is it so difficult for people to trust the work of established and credible scientists, even when they're talking about an issue that could save our population? What a great comment. Yeah, and I agree. I think it's disgraceful that it needs to be done. And the scientists should just say it, and we should believe them. I mean, it's sort of like using the medical thing again, walking to a doctor's office, and the doctor says, this is what's wrong. Here's what we need to do to fix it. You would, I think, immediately, get on board for that. Maybe you. Not immediately. Maybe you get a second opinion. Maybe you get a third opinion, but then you would. And Bob Inglis's point. Well, then if you got 100 second opinions or 99 second opinions, and they're almost all said the same, that's of course what you would do, and that would be the end of that. Unfortunately, that's not the way it works, and it's frustrating. It's absolutely, criminal that it's not. And I believe that, I'm going to put too strong an edge on that. But if people are out and out lying in a way that causes harm, it seems pretty criminal. And I think the fact that, you can't, lie about certain things, but in this case you can, and they do it all day long, and there's no sort of repercussion to it, and I think that's a problem in its own right, but we needn't get into it. But there it is. It's a huge problem. It's the reality. It's disgraceful. It's wrong. Scientists shouldn't have to do it. We shouldn't have to do it. I shouldn't have to do this course on it. I should be teaching courses in, English literature and other things, but it needs to be done, and someone has to do it. And you might think of yourself as an unlikely climate change messenger, but you can be, and if you can be and you want to be, I think you should. I think it needs to happen, unfortunately. Anyhow, let me continue. So I want to get through some. I recently listened to a podcast just explaining how to talk about politics with your family and friends during the holidays, when there are many of us see someone with opposing views like Uncle Pete. The podcast discussed how a group, Better Angels, would host workshops to promote self-reflection and mutual understanding. So I am not sure if it's the same one, but I think I actually listened to this podcast. And if so, the group is not called Better Angels, but Braver Angels, which is an easy thing to mix up. Better Angels is actually, I think it starts with a quote from Abraham Lincoln in his first inauguration, talking about the better angels of our nature, and became very famous recently because Steven Pinker wrote a book called Better Angels. But Braver Angels is this group. Oh, the podcast, if it's the same one, was 10% Happier with Dan Harris, which is a podcast on meditation and mindfulness, basically. But it notes how this group, Better Angels, and let's go back to the comment because this person actually explains it. If it is Braver Angels, but I'm not sure, but I think that is, would host workshops to promote self-reflection and mutual understanding. An example would be questions that they asked would be something like, what are some of the common stereotypes about my group, and what truths are they based upon? So it's not looking at the person you're standing against and thinking about the stereotypes there, but saying, well, what do people think about me? What are those stereotypes? And is there truth to it? That's a great question to ask. Both liberals and conservative had reasons to explain the truths, that there are, in fact, truths to those stereotypes. Having reflected on their own group stereotypes, conservatives and liberals were able to see each other more as human beings than as a stereotype that threatened their morals. This podcast, the readings for the week and Ken's introduction, reiterated my belief that communication is essential to getting someone to understand you, let alone change their opinion to agree with you. However, I had not before broken down the steps one must take to communicate effectively with opposers like the reading did this week. I'm happy to have gained this insight. It's sad that the important discussions I want to have would be with people who disagree with me on environmental issues, social justice issue, politics, and yet these are all interwoven. That they absolutely are. In other words, we've seen that, like, with the true cost and Rana Plaza disaster and all that. Social justice issues are all interwoven. Of course, politics is and all too. There is hope, though. Communication is powerful, and there are enough of us having conversations with the right people using these, that if enough of us have conversations with the right people using these communication skills, I think we can stir a lot of change in all of these realms. Such a great comment and such an optimistic note to end on for it. Yeah, so that group, Braver Angels, it's interesting if it is the same group and it is the same podcast, which may not be in both cases, but the guy who started them or has been most involved with them, at least the one who was interviewed in the podcast, actually had to start as a counselor, like a marriage counselor, and has skills on how to bring people together who are in conflict. And I guess that does happen in marriages. So, but those sort of skills can then be applied to other people who are in conflict. And then how do you deal with that? And that podcast, if it's worth looking up, by the way, if you have time and you like to listen to podcasts, 10% Happier is one of my favorite podcasts. But that episode was back, I think, around November or so. It was right, if I'm not mistaken, it was right after the election. There was a lot of tension, a lot of adversarial words going back and forth, and the thought was, well, what happens when your family gets together for Thanksgiving and you have people who are on opposite sides? How do you deal with that sort of potential conflict? Because emotions were so very high back then, still are, but there I was like, yeah, it was a lot happening. And I think it's worth listening to, because it's the same sort of series of things being addressed there than Richard Somerville did in the article that we read. And just the idea of stopping and for a moment and thinking, well, wait, what do people think about me? Okay, I fit the stereotype of a liberal, railing about against people about climate change and all. What's true about that? Anyhow, it's very useful to think about. And again, it all comes back to communication. And it's something I think people should think about more often, because, we often wind up, we wind up across from people who have opinions strongly against ours. And unfortunately, I think I want to say it's kind of at a height in the U.S. today regarding issues, and people have such strong feelings about things that we feel strong about, that you may feel strong about. Climate crisis can be one, social justice issues can be another, and there's strong oppositional feeling over things like Black Lives Matter, LGBTQIA rights, and all. And people, both sides, feel so incredibly strongly. And I think rightly, but then, how do you deal with the person across the table, especially when it's easy just to see what that person is advocating for? In other words, harm to a whole group of people by those beliefs. So, you're obviously you could get, as we started off with one comment, it's hard not to get angry at that point in time. But on the other hand, these ideas, people are didn't come up with on their own. I think they have to be countered. So I think it's a real challenge, and I'm just throwing that little comment in here because this class is about the climate crisis, and you can see the issue of communicating that this is important. But yeah, it's not the only issue out there. And as I think the last comment noted, it is interwoven with other issues. Actually, no, it's this person commented about social justice issues and all. It is all interwoven. So it's worth pausing on this notion of communication, because I think it's something that you may encounter a lot in your life, unfortunately. And sometimes, maybe in like a bubble like UCSB, you won't encounter it that much. But as you move around the world, move around the country and all, you may. So I think it's just worth thinking about how we communicate and how we think of, people when we're sort of across the table from them. Anyhow, let's go on. So I get some more comments. Another week, another fantastic reading. I'm glad people, at least this person liked it. I think a number of people did. As I'm sure many of you do, I have an Uncle Pete in my extended family. About a year ago, long before I enrolled in this class, I got in a pretty heated argument with him about climate change. A few hours after the discussion, I felt like I have completely missed an opportunity to accurately argue my side, and I felt as if my emotions had got the best of me when going head to head with a true climate change denier. Yeah, I think many people, myself included, have had experiences like this on the climate, with the climate crisis and other issues, sometimes social justice issues like the one I just mentioned. But the way this person framed it here, which is why I put this comment down, I thought was so great. And I won't show about this, read it here. I felt like I had completely missed an opportunity. I think, again, if you could go into these things, seeing them not as a debate that'll make you mad and fuming mad, but as an opportunity, and then that changes things, I think, because, and again, going back to the very first comment that I quoted, if you think of the person that you're standing against as not an adversary, but someone who's been kind of duped by a lot of disinformation, who's unfortunately fallen down the wrong rabbit hole in the internet, or through political or whatever affiliation feels connected up with this issue. If that happens, then I think your job is to see that as an opportunity. You can see that as an opportunity to help correct that disinformation, and as an opportunity to help that person see an issue more clearly that they're just not seeing clearly because they've been, convinced otherwise. I think that's absolutely an important way to go about it. And I think it is an opportunity. It may not feel that way at the time. It may feel like it's just the opposite, like this horrible day, this horrible thing happened in the middle of your day, and you may get angry and all. But I think in a part to try to stay calm about it and see it as an opportunity. But again, this is one extreme form of communication, right? Where you're actually encountering, someone like Uncle Pete. There may be other times where you're encountering people that it's still an opportunity, but it's not going to be adversarial like that. It's an opportunity to tell them about, the kind of food you're eating and how it's great, or how you like thrifting or something. Those could be far more pleasant and informative things, but in every case, what they are opportunities, and they are, I think, going back to the comment from one or two back about being a climate change messenger. It's an opportunity to be a type of climate activist, and specifically a climate change messenger. So I don't think those opportunities should be avoided. In other words, with like Uncle Pete, like, oh, I'm not going to talk about this with Uncle Pete because I know this is not going to end well. Maybe, but if you can, think about it in a different kind of way, it is an opportunity that you might want to actually, sort of seek out. Okay. I really like this week's reading. Really appreciate the advice about waiting to be asked about climate change as opposed to bombarding someone with all your knowledge about climate change. I often have friends wanting to have in-depth conversations about a topic I don't really care about, and it makes me even less interested in the topic that they do so. Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here to say we all have that experience. I think being on both sides of it, that, someone, maybe it's you read a book and suddenly you're really excited about something, and, you start telling everyone about it and all. And it's hard to remember sometimes that you're the one that's excited, and you would assume they're going to get excited about it, but it doesn't usually work that way. It doesn't often work that way. And again, that's, this is communication. You're trying to communicate, but that may not be the best strategy for something like that. One of the main problems with climate change is that big businesses like fossil fuel and oil companies are much better at communicating an idea to the general public than scientists are. If we work on getting clear messages out to the dangerous effects of global warming, it may help convince people who have been previously turned off climate change. The reading made me very hopeful that communication about climate change will get better and inspire more people to take action in fixing it. Spreading hopeful solutions and impassioned information will certainly be more effective than complex, boring data about climate change. Well, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. A number of great points here. First, that, this person notes that, fossil fuel companies and all are much better at communicating an idea to the general public than scientists are. The conservative think tanks that we've looked at, like the Heartland Institute and all, which is featured in both Climate of Doubt and Merchants of Doubt, they're very good at this. I mean, they have been working at it for 40 years. They cut their teeth on issues like, convincing the public that cigarettes weren't harmful. And they've been really good at doing this, at hiring people, and they are think tanks. I mean, they are literally sitting back trying to figure out ways of doing this. And, scientists aren't doing that. And there's no real parallel out there. There aren't, climate change think tank. Well, there are, but they're no way, as effective as conservative think tanks, or anywhere near as funded. So it then, suggests that, if we're going to counter this, it has to be sort of on the individual level. But I'm going to jump back to the comment here, why this person felt hopeful that, communication can inspire people to action. Spreading more hopeful solutions and impassioned information will certainly be more effective than complex, boring data about climate change. I think that's right. And again, with this course, I was able to, have you sit through roughly 3 weeks of boring, data and unpleasant things like watching the documentary on the fire at Paradise. But most people, that's not going to be very effective, and giving a bunch of boring data and all. I think it's far more effective to hear people talking about exciting lifestyle things, about how it's cool to go thrifting, and about all the things that can happen there, or about something like the documentary Game Changers, about athletes who are becoming or eating largely plant-based diets to become better athletes because of it. Those things are interesting and exciting to people, and there are a range of things like this. So part of the issue, and especially with friends, that again, Uncle Pete's one thing, but a lot of people, they don't know that much about the climate crisis. They don't know what they can do. They don't know how important some issues are. And I think communicating that and thinking of yourself as a climate change messenger can be really effective. And it doesn't have to be a really depressing message. We all don't have to be David Wallace Wells rattling through all the facts about, how bad climate migration is going to be, and how some of us will literally be cooked to death, which is what he says. Yeah, who wants to hear about that? But I think there are lots of other ways of communicating, and a lot more effective than that. I mean, those things will turn people off. And again, And I think people will be ready when they're ready. And I think that, and this goes back to the Gandhi thing, or it basically comes from Gandhi, but the phrase is not his, which is "be the change that you want to see in the world," which is what Peter Kalmus is trying to do, which is why he titled the book, his book and the documentary, "Being the Change," how to be that change, because I do think that is a very effective way of communicating, and I'll end on this insofar as it shows people, or underscores a great level of commitment, that if you're actually living your life according to certain precepts, that if you feel strongly enough about this to make, life decisions, and significant ones, whether it's largely plant-based diet or not having a car or any number of things, or even just getting out to, attend a protest or something. Any of that underscores how important you find it. And I think people will find that interesting and intriguing. And again, not if you're just, talking about it to them all the time when they're not interested. But I think people notice that sort of thing, and people do get curious about that sort of thing. So anyhow, I don't know all the answers here for sure, but I do know that communication is an important part of this, and being a climate change messenger is, to use another phrase from the comments here, an opportunity that you may want to think about. And it's complicated though, and I do think so. The one comment that noted the podcast, which I think might have been 10% happier. There's a lot of information out there on this, and then she had another thing that if you're interested in, you can find out. And what's really great is, again, and it goes to communication, that a couple decades ago, this would have meant going to a library and reading some, obscure psychological, article on how people respond to adversarial situations and all, which would be boring. But now you can listen to an interesting podcast, and there are all sorts of books out there and information on it if you're interested. Not that everyone has to, center their all their life's actions on being a climate change messenger, but it is something to think about, and in general, right? I mean, it's good to effectively be able to communicate to people, right? It's good not to turn people off, and if you feel strongly about something, it's good to be able to have a constructive conversation with someone rather than just getting, either boring them or both becoming angry. So. Okay, so that's it. And the next time we'll be talking about, next deep dive that I make will be about Peter Kalmus, and in fact on being the change, which is a very subtle form of communication, which is by, you're living your life in a certain way, and people will notice, I think. Okay, so take care, and I'll see you next time.